All right, guys, welcome back to the Sex and Bacon podcast. On today's episode, I have a guest with me, and I'm really excited for this conversation. This will be a different type of conversation than what you guys are used to me having. Very educational, informative. So I have with me Avgi Saketopoulou. Did I say that correctly?
Very correctly.
Very correctly? Okay, perfect. I'll get you to introduce yourself, a little bit about your background, your history, and then I think we can just dive straight into some of these topics here.
Great. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very excited for this conversation with you today. My background is I am an immigrant from Greece and Cyprus. I came to the States to be a psychoanalyst in my early 20s. But grew up bicultural between two nations and two cultures. And I arrived to the States determined to be an analyst, and that's what happened. And I work both clinically, seeing patients in my private practice, and I also do a lot of academic work, writing, speaking, teaching. I have a very curious mind, and I'm very excited about ideas.
Nice. Yeah, I was reading up on some of the stuff. So the first one, because I didn't even know that this existed. So the very first one that I do want to talk about, I did read up on that play. It's called Slave Play.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really know how to take it, I'll be honest. It was a little kind of one of those things. I'm like, wait a minute, this is a thing? People do that? Why would people want to do that? And then very easily, there was a lot of people had written blogs and their personal interpretations of experiences when they had experienced this type of sexual play, but in a non-consenting way. And that's what blew my mind, was just like hearing how disturbing it was for them to experience these things. But I mean, there is a whole network of consenting adults who do this. So can you kind of give, I guess, an explanation, maybe in a little bit more depth, about like what that is, and I guess kind of where that came from, and a little bit of your take on it?
Mm-hmm. Sure. It was a great place to start. I think, let me start by saying a little bit about the play itself for audiences that may not know the play. So this was a play that was written by a Black queer playwright by the name of Jeremy O. Harris. And he produced it while he was still a student in Yale, and eventually came downtown in New York City, and eventually moved to Broadway for two productions. Ended up getting nominated for the most number of nominations, Tony nominations a play has ever had, receiving none, which goes to tell you right off the bat how controversial the play was. It generated tremendous enthusiasm and excitement, and also tremendous anxiety and difficulty and criticism. And certainly Jeremy O. Harris has been criticized for this play for kind of like quite seriously. There were petitions to shut it down. Now, why was that? Because you see like on the marquee the title Slave Play, and you walk in imagining that you will watch I don't know what, but what you end up getting is both not what you were expecting and exactly what that title is about. So I'm hesitant to talk about the content of the play because I don't want to spoil it for anybody who has not seen it, because it's really a play worth seeing as opposed to reading or hearing about. But what I will say is that it portrays the erotic relations of three couples who are trying to figure out how to rekindle erotic desire that has become dormant for the Black partners. They're all interracial couples, mostly Black and white. And in one case, the race of one person is ambiguous, but he's white adjacent. And the first act is extremely both shocking and upsetting for a lot of people. That's the time during the play that a lot of people walk out. This is the part of the play that has generated the most, kind of like a lot of the criticism. Because what you see is a depiction of kind of like what in any other context would look like kind of like really vile racial stereotypes being played out, only in the first act they're being played out in the context of sexual relations and erotic engagement. And it's kind of like this entanglement between trauma, especially racial trauma, and the erotic is very, very difficult. In the book that I wrote that largely centers on this play, I talk a lot about what consent means. The book's called Sexuality Beyond Consent. And I talk a lot about kind of like how limited the way that we think about consent may be. And thinking about Blackness and trauma has been very critical for me in being able to think about what a sexuality beyond consent means. So you see all of these scenes that play out, and kind of like it's very hard to tell what is happening there. On first view, they look like scenes of violation. But very quickly, as the play proceeds, you come to realize that these were not scenes of violation, at least not in the way that we understand violation in the everyday sense of the word. But rather, they were scripted scenarios that the couples had orchestrated ahead of time and played out with each other as part of a strange therapy that Jeremy O. Harris has come up with that intends to kind of like get them from a place of being stalled with erotic desire for each other to having something become reanimated. And the rest of the play is like tries to negotiate the questions of what comes up in interracial relations, but does it not only from the perspective that we're used to today in talking about interracial relations in that sense of kind of like privilege and kind of like recognition and rights, but it does it also through arguing in a very strange way that objection is a certain kind of erotic resource, which is a very paradoxical thing to say and very might sound very strange, especially at a moment. I mean, we are just dealing with yet another murder of a Black person, so it's very hard in the aftermath of this ongoing violence and anti-Blackness, which is extremely powerful in the white psyche, but not only, as we see in this last murder. Anti-Blackness is kind of like at the beating heart, I would say, of American life. So it's very hard to take that side by side with why would somebody be having an erotic entanglement that plays with that plays with basically plays with fire, plays with history in this particular way. And this is what the play is actually doing. The play is drawing on also like a very established, even though controversial, sexual fetish in BDSM communities, which is called race play. So it's not coming.
So is it meant to be though therapeutic, or is it meant to be a kink?
You're talking about BDSM, or you're talking about the play?
The race play, just race play in general. Like you kind of mentioned, if we in the play, like something about healing some trauma and stuff. Like, is that typically something that like interracial couples will use more for dealing with traumas in that way, and that's one way to navigate it? Or is it strictly that it was, I guess people use it as more of just like a fetish or a different type of a kink?
I think that's a very interesting question. Let me break it down a bit. Let me say right off the bat, when you say, is this something that interracial couples use? This is by no means like a standard practice or a mainstream sexual interest. It's quite niche.
Okay.
So that needs to be said. Certainly, I wouldn't want anybody imagining that any interracial couple they see is actually engaging in race play.
Right.
Even though I would point out something that Melina Williams-Haas writes about. Melina Williams is a Black woman who identifies as a race player and has been in interracial BDSM relationships that are very much organized around race and race play. And she says that there are many ways in which she, as a Black woman, doesn't actually get to opt out of race play. Meaning that she will be, she has this very powerful example that she uses, talking about being in a BDSM club and doing a scene with her top, who is a white man, who is, I think, whipping her. I'm not sure exactly what, but he's topping her. And after the scene is over, a white woman goes up to her and says, "This was so hard to watch. Like I just cannot bear to watch race play." like this white man humiliating you. And Melanie Williams comments that actually this was not a race play scene. This was just a bottoming scene. But it is impossible it's in the eye of the beholder to prioritize. Right. So I mentioned this because it's such a powerful example of how kind of like the question of whether race play is voluntary or not, whether one can opt out of it or not, also depends on the subjectivity, the positionality of the person who's participating in the scene and how they're being kind of like interpolated, how they're being, what meaning is made out of the scene. So with that said, there is a very powerful rhetoric in the BDSM community that BDSM is healing, that it allows you to take past trauma and do it differently or doing under your control, orchestrate past events that have wounded you and do something else with them. But part of what I argue in my book is that this way of thinking about it will only take you so far. And here I bring to the conversation the fact that I am a clinical psychoanalyst and I do clinical work and work with a lot of traumatized people, and argue that, you know, the trauma is never healed. Like, it leaves behind wounds and scars that we're drawn to touch, but it never goes away. Nobody has ever been cured of their trauma. Nobody has ever been delivered out of their trauma. At best, what happens is that we live in the aftermath of our trauma under different conditions, and we learn to do different things with it. And the notion that BDSM is healing falls under a category of thinking that I describe as traumatophobic, like being afraid of the impact that trauma has on our lives, as opposed to welcoming not the trauma itself, which of course if we can avoid trauma, certainly racial trauma and racial inequities. This is not about not being political or not having good racial politics. But once trauma is there, the idea that it can be extinguished or taken out or in some way kind of like fully repaired, I think it's a big illusion. It's a cultural illusion, and I think it's also an illusion in my field. That's part of what I'm trying to speak against in the book.
As you were kind of explaining that, you know, about like the BDSM and the situation that that woman was in, where somebody was perceiving it, it's funny because as you said that, kind of in my mind, I thought the same thing. It was like, why would somebody assume when they see an interracial couple doing a fetish or a kink that it was about race? Like, to me, from what I read up on a lot of people's take on experiences that they had, it was when the derogatory terms got thrown in, you know, that then it became very like, whoa, what is happening? I'm in a race play situation that I didn't want to be in. But I mean, in a BDSM club or in any kink situation, just to see an interracial couple enjoying themselves, you know, that's not where my mind would have gone to be like, oh, this is disturbing to see. Maybe if there was those terms and some of those words thrown in that very much then depicted that, like, that's exactly what was happening, I would maybe go there. But just to see people, you know, enjoying themselves, having some fun, that's not where my mind would go. So it's kind of funny that that's where that, you know, white woman's mind went the minute she saw an interracial couple doing anything kinky or fun in any situation. So I find that interesting that people just automatically assume to see them together that it had to be something other than the same sexual enjoyment that they were having with their partners. But yeah, I mean, I guess that a lot of people do. So do you think though, with that though, I mean, it kind of goes, it really is just dependent on a person's thought process towards everything, really. Like, I mean, like, I think of it as, okay, like role playing. I mean, people role play the priest and the young girl thing. And I mean, that's a sad reality that goes on in the world just as much, and disturbing things that people have to deal with, right? But I mean, yet in the bedroom, they'll turn it into, you know, a kink, a fantasy, and people probably would never really question it because it's not probably something that people overly share, I guess, openly, of like, oh, we're into this weird, you know, fetish, this weird kink. But this one is obviously one that, with the play being out there, then becomes kind of topic of conversation at the forefront. I mean, I guess if somebody wrote a play about a priest and a whole bunch of, little boys or little girls, then sure, it would be something where it's like, whoa, now we're really diving into the fact that this is something that is also in porn and it's something that people are doing. And there would be a whole conversation about it. But I wouldn't have even really known that this existed if it wasn't for, this conversation we're having. But obviously, to other people, it is a big thing. But then I'm reading up on it that there was a bunch of, Pornhub had removed porn that, kind of had that. And so it's like now that it's a conversation, people now are kind of like, oh, is that okay? Now that this has been put out there showing us that this exists, how are we dealing with it? And the questions around why are people doing this? And I guess consent is the big thing. I mean, behind closed doors, if a couple feels that this is something that they both want to engage in, it works for them in whatever way, whether in a kink way, whether in a therapeutic way, whether in a way of bringing forward those traumas and having those conversations. I guess the big part is consent with it. If they're consenting and this is something that they feel works for them, I suppose, is it frowned upon then if they're both consenting and they've agreed to it? Or is it really then when it boils down to more of people being part of it, not knowing they were part of it and not consenting to it? And then that's where more of the offense comes from.
What a fascinating question, partly because I should say, while certainly this play has brought race play to the surface for more people than before, there have been conversations and heated debates around race play, definitely in BDSM communities for a very long time. And okay. So it's I want to say this to emphasize that the conversation about this is long and ongoing, as is the debate, as is the disagreement, as is the upset. So I want to go back to something that you said, which I think is a very important rubric to think about consent. Like when you say, well, people do whatever they're going to do behind closed doors, and as long as both are consenting, that should be okay, which is more or less the premise under which all BDSM functions. So I want to say two things that will take us in two conflicting directions, and then I want to pull them back together. Okay. The first is to say the following, that consent, consent I think is a very problematic concept, especially the notion of affirmative consent, the notion that two adults get together, agree on something, and then whatever they agree on is okay. The notion that consent will get us out of, consent has promised and has really under-delivered in helping us adjudicate what is good sex, what is fair sex, what is safe sex. If anything, what consent does is it tries to make sure that sex is good and safe and fair. I'm not so sure that has actually happened. I'm not sure that two people getting together and agreeing that what they're going to do is okay will cover us, because cover them, not us. I mean, who cares about us? Like, cover them. Partly because this is not how trauma works. Trauma is not always consciously accessible. What will come up during an encounter cannot be anticipated. And the deeper a relationship and the deeper an erotic connection, the more risks are taken. And that's actually what makes sex hot. And the hotter it gets, the more you move out of the category of consent. I mean, many times good sex is confusing sex. You're like, what just happened? Like, what was that? How did I get there? I mean, you can rationalize after the fact, like, oh, this is because of that, or it reminded me of such and such, or it must have made me this and that. Maybe sometimes these stories we tell ourselves are accurate. Maybe they just make us feel better about ourselves. But there are intensities that come up in sexual encounters that actually are not fully covered by the contractual arrangements of consent. So part of what I try to do in the book is talk about a different kind of consent, which I call limit consent, which is not about which is not about guarding the self, so that if you and I are having sex, I make sure that you're not harming me and I'm not harming you. But it's about risking something with each other and stepping into the fray of that risk together. And that is a very different way of thinking about consent. A consent that is about enlarging experience and exposure, rather than a consent that is about guarding the self. And in many ways, I think that kind of like race plays an extremely powerful example of that, because nobody in their right mind would do a race play scene. Nobody who's aware enough of race relations and racial difference and their own racial positionality. And I should mention, I mean, here we are, two people talking about like race play right now. I'm white, I'm not black identified. I don't know what your race is, but you're white passing. So I think that also needs to be mentioned. So I can't imagine anybody thoughtfully stepping into a race play scene without being aware that they're basically stepping into a landmine.
Yeah.
So the question would be, why would somebody step into a landmine? That's a limit consent question. It's not a consent question. Because if you want to be safe, the safest thing is to stay out of it. And that extends also to other forms of playing with trauma, not just racial trauma, but also a lot of sexual play that is organized around trauma play, psychically organized around trauma play, begins to court with these kinds of energies that are very dangerous. And that's part of what makes them hot. That's part of what makes them so exciting, why it makes people want to like throw caution to the wind. So the question of like, how do you not throw caution to the wind but take risks? How do you throw the dice and step into the fray of something very difficult with another person? I think that's the tricky part about thinking about moving a conversation from thinking about affirmative consent, which is about ensuring safety, to thinking about limit consent, which is also about what could enable a transformational experience. Like if you and I sit down and kind of like do a negotiation list and agree exactly on what we're going to do or not do to each other, we may have like a good experience, but we're not going to have a transformational experience.
Right.
Transformational experiences require something else. They're not experiences that make you feel secure. They're experiences that shake you to the core of your being, that meet you at the limit of what you can bear. And for that, affirmative consent is really limp. I am curious what you're thinking about how what I'm saying is sounding to you.
I mean, it's funny, until this year, I mean, the whole concept and the conversation around consent was really nothing people talked about. It was just like as much as what it is now. And I mean, I even experienced it when I went to a local taboo show. It was like even just, oh, can I try those candles? Do I have your consent to pour this on you? It was every table I went to asked me that. And I'm like, what is happening? I have all my clothes on. I'm just asking you to put this. But it was just like very clear. Do I have consent to put that cream there? And it's like, okay. So then it kind of came up, and I've had a few conversations around it with people, and they said that it is always changing. What you consent to today, or maybe in this minute, doesn't mean you consent to tomorrow or in an hour from now. So then it made me start to think about, I guess, as you were explaining all of this, I started to think, okay, I think of it in the way of you consent to doing something with your partner, but the reality is until you start to experience it, you don't really actually know the triggers or the traumas that it could bring up. And what you thought you would enjoy as it's happening, you then realize this isn't working for you, or this has now brought other things to the surface that are issues or for concern. And I guess that's where trauma and triggers really do kind of stem from, in that sense of like things that are kind of buried down deep inside of us. And until something kind of happens that all of a sudden brings it up, sometimes you don't even realize that you're holding on to that trauma or that you've been triggered by these events, right? So I guess it's like,
but can I
go ahead
for a second?
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking, yes, right, absolutely. But then there's also a third possibility, which is that as this something else starts happening in you that you didn't expect, you may not just feel this feels bad. You may also feel this feels bad, but also really hot. Or you may feel this feels bad, but also like really bad in a really strange way. Or maybe I'll let this go on for a moment more. Or it feels bad, but I'm really drawn into it.
Okay.
This is where... And, it's very, right now we are both kind of like not in a sexual state, which means that we have our faculties more or less intact. But in the moment of a sexual experience, this is not how things work. And I'm saying this not to say, look, we don't have all of our faculties then, so we should have everything organized now when we're thinking sanely so that we don't get carried away then. The sexual state is a state of its own. And to try to police it or to try to control it ahead of time is also to control how far you can go with yourself. Again, of course, this part of why this is tricky to talk about is because, of course, like violations happen, and of course, kind of like different subjects are more vulnerable to these violations, like women, trans people, people of color, people with disabilities. Like, there's no question that violations of consent happen. So I'm not making an argument by any means that no's do not matter.
Right.
But I am saying that we don't know what yeses mean. And also sometimes our no's are also ways of keeping ourselves safe.
Right.
From having experiences that could actually be, I mean, I'm thinking about can I put this cream on you, like in the store?
Yeah.
Like I went to a play the other day and one of the ushers touched my phone and then looked at me quite panicked and said, do I have your permission to touch your phone? I was like, it's not even my body. I mean, the level of anxiety. But think also, I don't know if you've had experiences like that, but certainly I've talked to a lot of people and I've had experiences where something happens not with my consent, but it actually opens up something in you.
Right.
Something that you wouldn't have expected, something that you would have never imagined. So there's this really beautiful moment in a paper I really love by Tim Dean, where he talks about he's a very well-known queer theorist, and he writes about, he used to write about barebacking a lot. And now he has written this paper, which I absolutely adore, which is on piss play. And he's describing this experience about how he used to be a piss top.
Sorry.
And
I think I'm understanding what you're saying, like as in pee?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just wanted to clarify that because I was like, I've never heard it actually used, I guess, as like an actual term of like that was a thing. But yes. Okay.
Yeah, that's a thing.
Okay.
So it's basically the practice of urination for erotic pleasure, of one person urinating, right? So so he's talking in this paper about how he was always the top. He describes this particular moment where he's in a gay bar and he meets this guy who's wearing like a stranger's never met him before, and this guy takes him to the back and Tim Dean is beginning to give him a blowjob. And as he's blowing him, he is beginning to feel something in his lips, and then he's realizing, oh my God, this guy's like pissing in my mouth. And he says, I did not consent, and I would not have consented to this. But the orgasm I had was one of the most powerful erotic experiences. And he has this line, which is really beautiful, where he says, that night in that like dark room, like that stranger gave me the gift of erotic astonishment. And it is so powerful because he says, had I been asked, I would not have consented. So his consent was not violated. He was not asked. Mm-hmm. But he has this experience which really meets him at the border of what he might have never had that experience, right? And that experience of erotic astonishment is not an experience that comes with consent. It's an experience that comes with something else. Now, if he had felt horrified with this, if he had felt violated or even raped, we would completely understand that. And I would say, absolutely what happened was violating because you did not ask for this, you did not agree. And yet, that's the risk that two people take in the domain of limit consent.
Okay. I get that because I do feel that 90% of the boundaries that get crossed in the bedroom with your partner or with even a one night stand, it is because all of a sudden somebody did something, put a hand somewhere, a finger somewhere. And that's a natural thing that people test the boundaries. It's like, oh, she let me do this. I wonder if I kept moving my hand further, if I could do that. Or even girls. I mean, we get a kick out of seeing how close we can get a finger to a guy's, anus, and if they'll let us pop it in before they say no, right? Like, that's a normal kind of like, how far can I test this? How far can I push these boundaries? You know, and like, you're right, it doesn't come up as conversation in the moment. It just comes up as, I've grabbed this toy out of the nightstand and I'm going to see if he's going to let me slide that in there, or if he's going to, you know, swap my hand away. And I think it's because we kind of sometimes in the bedroom have that mentality of, it's better to, you know, ask for forgiveness than permission. You know, if I stop and I ask you, can I do this to you? And you have a moment to think about it, you're probably going to be like, no. But it's like, if I just bring it out and I introduce it gently or slowly and see your reaction, then it's like, you know, how far can I push you out of your comfort zone to enjoying this? And sometimes, yes, you get shocked and surprised by each other's enjoyment into something that you didn't know that you would enjoy.
You know, I hear what you're saying. And I certainly understand these kinds of experiences, but it's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about limit consent.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. Because I think it's one thing if you're thinking, you know, I'd like to do that, the other person might not let me, maybe I just slide it in. That's a different kind of premise than what I'm talking about.
Okay.
And it does begin to get kind of like tricky if you go down that path. Like, for example, if you were just to invert the situation for a moment, if you were a man and you didn't know if a woman wanted anal sex and you were like, well, I'm going to stick it in and see if she says no, that begins to get tricky, especially if this is an intent, right? I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about moments that are not planned, that are not about trying to get something experienced or done that the other person may not. I'm talking about things that also take you by surprise.
Okay, so it's both parties kind of unaware of the fact that they've just gone there kind of thing.
It's about risking something. Like, for example, people who do race play may be negotiating kind of like words or this or that. But there are territories into which once you're there, you're there. And it doesn't matter what you've negotiated.
Okay.
Like if something opens up around trauma, that's why I'm also saying that this is not so much about healing. Like, are you going to have a good experience or not? The truth is, nobody knows. You don't know. Your partner doesn't. You may have the most loving, considerate partner. Like a lot of factors come into play, and this is what makes it complicated.
Yeah, very.
But it's also very complicated. So this is not kind of like the kind of sexuality. When I talk about sexuality beyond consent, I'm talking about a kind of sexuality or sexual moments or experiences that have more to do with erotic astonishment than have to do with guarding the self.
Okay.
And it's not a whole story of sexual politics. Like you can't do, like your whole erotic life cannot be like that. First of all, it would be unbearable to live like that. It's too much intensity. And also it's too much risk. It's not for everyone. It's not for every moment. But what I am trying to speak to are experiences, both erotic experiences and also aesthetic experiences. Like going to watch a play like Slave Play that is actually quite... It's not just erotic in its depictions, it requires an erotic participation of the audience. And it has a lot of elements of sadism, kind of like in its relationship to the audience. For example, there is this very powerful moment where the director of the Broadway production, Robert O'Hara, says, you know, the play runs without an intermission. And it's done purposefully so, partly because people would walk out after the first act, and all of the intensities and the kind of like the repetitions of atrocities in the first act. But part of what he also says in explaining this choice is he says, this is happening on the stage and you want to go pee, like hold it, like that's the level in which you're going to engage with a play. Walk out. If you're going to stay, you're going to have to. It's going to have to cost you.
Right.
And this question of it costing us something is part of what affirmative consent tries to do away with. I'm not talking about the costing of like the other person should be given a chance to violate you. That's not obviously not what I'm talking about. But if you're going to take a risk, like, you know, it's a risk. If you're going to sit in the theater and watch something that is as intense as a reenactment of kind of like erotic violations, which have happened historically, and sit there and laugh with the jokes, because the play is also extremely funny at moments, then it's going to have to cost you something. And it is that interplay between kind of like this resurgence of trauma, the reminder that race play is not just about the black partner, it's also about the white partner. White people too have a racial history of oppression or of a complicity or of participation. When one of the things that I interviewed a black activist for the book, Mike Bond, who said something very interesting to me. He said to me, it was very hard for me to find white women to play with me, to do race play with me, because nobody wanted to be a racist.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. I don't know that I could ever put myself in a position to ever say those things because I would just feel gross saying it. But it's funny because I would never, and maybe because I'm not racist, and when I look at couples, I don't automatically think of the history of those things. To think of like them being together is controversial or any of those. To me, people like people. Do you know what I mean? So, but I could see how it could be very confusing for people who don't live in that space, and that's not where their mind goes. And if your mind doesn't naturally go there and those things don't exist in the way that you see people, it's hard to put yourself in that setting to understand why, one, people would want to then walk down that road and be in that situation, but then also how to navigate those conversations. Because there's a lot of depth that goes into it. And it is very confusing, even just from the conversation that we've had, and trying to put yourself in some of those situations or understanding the limitations of those things. Like, there's a lot to that. And I don't think people are as aware or as conscious for those conversations, especially in a sexual situation. Right? And I think when it comes to sex in general or kinks and experiences, like you said, very in the moment stuff can happen. People just openly go into a situation where it's, let's, do this, and it can evolve. But I don't really know that you're right. Like, I don't think that people really stop to have those aha moments or those conversations at the time all the time. Like, I think it is really one of those things that let's just do this and see what happens. The conversations don't come, and sometimes the conversations don't even come afterwards. What did you experience? What did you feel? This, that. It's just so transactional. Like, there has to be quite the connection and quite the relationship for people to be having those type of conversations. And I think that that's lacking more so than what it actually exists.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a very important point, because there's a certain kind of intimacy, even if you're not close with somebody, there's an intimacy to having these conversations. And they're not, I agree with you that, if kind of like oftentimes these conversations are conversations that may happen after an experience has happened. And it's not always easy to stick around for these kinds of experiences, especially when they don't go well.
Right.
Especially when they don't go well, people can feel very guilty or very anxious. But I think that also that the notion of having conversations about sex is also overrated. Like, there's only so much that you can talk about sex before it actually becomes not sex, but a conversation about sex.
Right.
And it becomes boring and disinteresting. Like, at some point you're going to have to take a risk, and the risk is not risking the other person's safety, it's risking your safety. Like, think about what you were saying just a moment ago. Like, I wouldn't do race play, you said, because I wouldn't want to say those things, right? So that's a risk that one would take with oneself if one were to engage in something like that.
Right.
Which is a very different way of thinking about it than thinking only about the risk to the other person. This is what limit consent is also trying to negotiate. Whereas affirmative consent is so preoccupied with kind of like making sure that the other person is safe or that the other person doesn't harm me. So it's more kind of like looking out. This is also about kind of like taking more seriously, what does it mean to ethically step into the fray of engaging a lover in a scene? It doesn't have to be race play. It could be like another kind of trauma play. Or you were talking earlier about like, age difference play, or play that has to do with the church, or plays on other kinds of stereotypes or other kinds of experiences or traumata. Like, people have been abused by priests. And one strand of fetishes in the BDSM community very much engages trauma
Right.
around the sexual. If you're going to play with somebody who has had trauma and you don't want to hurt them, if you're not like a malignant sadist or a careless or thoughtless person, but you still are going to step into that with them, you're going to feel very anxious.
Why do you think that people have such a need to cross those lines, put themselves in those situations, test those boundaries for over just, I guess, I don't want to say the typical and the vanilla, because I don't think that that's necessarily what it is, but just over your standard type of sexual interactions, intimacy, foreplay, toys, this or that? Like, why do you think that people feel the need to cross such boundaries with some of these things?
It's a very interesting way of asking this question, because I would like to invert the question and see what you think of it. I think we can also ask, why do people end up oftentimes staying constrained within certain boundaries and don't explore further? I think that that's another way to ask this question. I'm offering this not to say that that's a better question or the more important question. I'm offering this just to highlight how accustomed we are to thinking about safety when it comes to sex. Kind of like, what does it mean to go beyond the domain of safety and into something that is both potentially more endangering, but also more thrilling? And I don't say this in a nonchalant way. To say, oh, like, take your risks, you may get an experience of erotic astonishment. I'm saying that because there's something I think very, really precious around trauma and about experiences that have hurt us that can only be touched in very limited ways. That we can only come into contact with it in very limited ways. So, there's these ongoing conversations, especially now, of like notions around healing trauma or repairing trauma, or kind of like putting our ghosts away, like exorcising our ghosts. But what we, I think, don't realize is that we also want to commune with our ghosts. That our ghosts are part of who we are. We become who we are partly through our trauma. And this notion of trying to get rid of our trauma or heal it also implies getting rid of a part of oneself. It's extremely intimate to be in a traumatized part of oneself with another person. Like, I see this every day because I work as a clinician, so I see this in a very different context. Like, part of the intimacy of the clinical situation is somebody walks in and tells you something that they haven't told anybody else, something like really difficult about themselves. Now there's a tie. Part of that tie is because like being able to be seen in that, or to see oneself in that, is extremely intimate. And that's a different kind of intimacy than the intimacy of like trusting somebody, or the intimacy of, we had a good experience together, I know you're not going to hurt me. It's the intimacy of somebody seeing you in your kind of like more stripped down, and I say this kind of like symbolically stripped down way. That is extremely powerful. So if we look at what in the book I call traumatophilia, like the affinity to trauma, the approaching of trauma, if we look at it from that perspective, then we might become curious about people who don't let themselves go there, rather than become curious about people who will go there as opposed to not going there. Like, if that...
Yeah. No, I get it. Like what you're saying. It's funny because like when you flip the question right away, in my mind, it was just like, well, because people are so afraid and they feel shameful sometimes for the thoughts or the curiosities or the desires that they have. And they're usually fearful that if they voice those things that they'll be judged. I mean, we've grown up with the fact that sex is shameful. It's supposed to look like this. Don't do that. Don't do that. And if you do, you're, a pervert, a weirdo, this, that. So you grow up knowing and thinking all of those things that society and your parents and people around you have put on, sex itself. So I understand why people live in a box of not wanting to try new things or not wanting to voice their desires. And it is out of a place of just you're feeling like you'll be judged or you're just embarrassed. Your partner will leave you. He'll think you're a weirdo. What if he's not into the same things that I'm into? So that part I've always understood. I guess sometimes when I think that people are searching past, say, what your typical fantasies or desires or fetishes or things would be, and don't get me wrong, I think it's one very beautiful that people can be very free in their thought processes and their ability to communicate their fantasies and their desires with somebody. I think it's very beautiful when people can step outside their comfort zone, test their own boundaries and limitations, see what they're into, and have open conversation about it. But then there is a part of me that does sometimes think that once we've gotten to that part where we can basically try anything, check these things out, is it one because we've now been desensitized, and the rush you got from the very first time that you tried, say, BDSM, or the rush that you got from the very first time that you watched your partner have sex with another woman in front of you, it's like you're constantly trying to top that. You're constantly trying to search that out again, that initial feeling of excitement that you did something. So that's where sometimes I'm like, okay, is that what it is? Is that we've just then, the people who are very open are just, now there is no limits, but because we're trying to chase that high essentially in a sexual way.
Mm-hmm. And do you eventually exhaust it, is what I hear you say.
I mean, I guess, because like I guess even for myself, I mean, there's a lot of things that I obviously have not done and some things that I didn't even know were a thing. But even as I read about them, I'm like, well, I don't want to do that. But then I guess it's in my mind, I think of myself of where I'm at sexually. And I'm kind of like, well, I mean, I've done a whole lot of things. I feel like I've experienced everything. And like, it's kind of one of those things where a couple of my girlfriends who are very open, we joke about it as well, is like, well, I mean, if I didn't have sex the rest of my life, I mean, I guess I'd probably be okay in the sense where it's just like, I've done it all. I've seen it all. Meh. But then it's like, okay, but is it now, then it's that same thing. It's like where I need to be challenged and I need something even more than what I've ever experienced to kind of get my mind racing in a way of, oh, maybe I could try that. Maybe that would turn me on, because you do exhaust almost the standard, I guess, of intimacy, and you're almost trying to out weird yourself, I guess, in a very, simple way of putting it. But I mean, I don't know. I guess some people just are into what they're into, maybe. But how do you know if you're into those things?
Yeah. I mean, I want to pick up on a couple of things from what you said and see if I can try to share some of my thoughts about your question, because, you were saying earlier, kind of like I've tried the things that I'm into, or what if I'm into this and my partner is not into that? And I am not talking necessarily about experiences that one is into that one is ashamed of. Obviously, that also happens. Like, part of what has always felt very important to me about this example about the piss play scene is that this is not a desire that he had, that he was unaware of, or that he didn't dare indulge. Like, it just wasn't there. And something gets created in the moment, right? Those things that get created in the moment are different than, well, here's a checklist of like 10 different kind of like positions and I've done 9 of them, like maybe the 10th will get me off, right? It's about discovering something in the moment that is not about like, oh, it turns out I'm into piss play. I don't know what the answer is about this for Tim Dean, whether he then got into piss play or not. My guess is not. It's about the singularity of these moments. It's more about singularity rather than the amassing of experience, which is kind of like a very capitalist way that we're led to think about a number of different things, including sex. Like, you collect experiences, and then you have enough. Should you need more? Which one are you missing? Like, how do you get to having kind of like more fun and more excitement? Of course, I'm also talking about fun and excitement, but I'm talking about things that arise in the moment when we go into when we don't go into an experience looking for something, but when we go into an experience opening ourselves to being stunned by something that somebody else brings to us. So, for example, you were saying, what if I'm into something and my partner is not? What if your partner brings something to you? I'm not saying you, but like you, whatever. What if your partner brings something to you and it's not what you're into? What if you allowed yourself to actually move into that? What might happen? Again, this is not a how-to or here's like more ways to have sex kind of talk. It's more about how we guard ourselves and how we hold ourselves back to keep ourselves safe. So, you meet a new lover and they say, you know what, I'm not into kind of like heels. I don't want to wear heels during sex. Like, I mean, that's interesting. Like, what is that self-image about? It's not about forcing the other person to do this or that, right? Or if you're thinking, I don't want to do it this way, like, what is that about? Like, there might be moments with a partner where that boundary softens and you find yourself drawn into it. And part of what I'm trying to say in Sexuality Beyond Consent is that the moments that softens usually have something to do with trauma.
Okay.
It's the way in which we are drawn back to our traumatic experiences. Like, there is this illusion that kind of like all people want to do is stay away from traumatic experiences. But as a clinician, I'll tell you, this is absolutely not true. Like, we are drawn back to our trauma. We are drawn back to touch our wounds, to rub up against them, to experience them again. So the question is, do you experience them in a problematic way? Like, as in, my field certainly has a lot of terms for that. Repetition compulsion, or do you, kind of like, what about moments when one throws oneself into experience? Like, you can go watch a play like Slave Play and feel offended and get up and leave. And if that's how you feel, I absolutely respect that. But what if the moment that you start feeling the pushback of, you know what, this is disgusting, I want nothing to do with it. There are moments when we might allow experiences like that to come into us and move us. You may still not like the play, but you feel moved as a human being in a direction that you didn't expect. Same I think with sex. I think there's a lot of parallels between art and sex.
Right.
Kind of like not sex, but erotic encounters. I'm not just talking about like wanting to get off or wanting to kind of like just have a one night stand and just get it over with because it's just wanting to have a sexual experience. I'm talking about erotic experience that opens up to something that's much deeper, not necessarily about intimacy in the sense of feeling close or connected, but intimacy in the sense of kind of like the exposure in yourself and the other's exposure to you.
Okay. Let's talk about your book for a minute. So it doesn't come out yet. It comes out in like a week, correct?
In a week, yes.
Okay. So, and you've said the title a few times. So it is, sorry, I'll let you say go ahead.
It's Sexuality Beyond Consent.
Okay.
Risk, Race, Traumatophilia.
Okay. So it is more centered around kind of that premise about the traumas and then how I guess that gets kind of dealt with through sexuality or through sex?
Not dealt with,
Okay.
Experienced.
Okay.
Not dealt with. Because precisely what I'm doing is like I'm really pushing back against the discourse of like sex being a way of working through trauma or repairing trauma or having a better experience that then corrects the past.
Yeah, because I guess I've always thought of it as, I guess from my own personal experience, I mean, there is trauma that I had from a child that like, I've talked about it before, where it is almost like there's that void. And it was kind of one of those things where it's like, I found for myself, I was using sex as a way to, I guess, mask it. Right? It was one of...
That's different.
Okay. So...
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to give a little bit more, I guess, context or a little bit more detail kind of about, your book, what it is into or what it's about and what people will kind of get from reading it?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. And thank you also for reminding us kind of like of this very important fact that, you know, sex can also be used as a way of avoiding oneself and avoiding connection and kind of like skipping over something, especially around trauma. So in some sense, I would say that the kind of erotic experiences that my book is concerned with is the inverse opposite of that, about ways in which sex actually drops you into yourself, or rather you find yourself into an erotic experience. So the book starts with this very interesting vignette from shared with me with a patient, and I shared it with a patient's permission in the book, which is that this patient is having an erotic contact with a lover, and they have negotiated that the lover would slap her, and she slaps her, and the person I'm speaking with says, that slap landed so perfectly. It was the right force, it was the right place in my face, it was the right expression on her face. She was like, this is a slap that was so exquisite, and I didn't expect it. I expected a mediocre slap. And she saved words. She saved words, not because her limits were violated, but because she got something that was even more than what you would have expected.
Okay.
Which is a very interesting way to think about safe wording. Usually safe words are about, oh, I didn't want that, as opposed to, oh, I didn't think you were going to do it that well. So, you know, the book starts out with this example because I think that I want to interest the reader in what can happen in moments that kind of like something exquisite may be coming our way and we get frightened and pull away from it. And there are several clinical examples in the book where I talk about how some of these things have come up with patients and kind of like how they've affected me and my position in the room. I talk a lot about slave play and also really interrogate my own kind of like really intense relationship with the play. I became very preoccupied with the play. I went and saw it again and again and again. I started teaching about it, writing about it. I was just in Ohio for the new production. So I have a lot of kind of like things to say about what I think that's about for me and kind of like how I'm drawn into it. And I also, the book kind of like moves through discussing sexuality and erotics and the way that we've been talking about, discussing aesthetic experience, theater, art, talking about traumatophilia and this critique that I have of traumatophobia, of the ways in which we're afraid of our traumata and afraid of approaching trauma in other people and recognizing that trauma is there without trying to get rid of it and remembering that trauma also makes us who we are. We may have not wished it were there. On the ethical level, it's not good that trauma exists, cultural trauma, social trauma, familial trauma, but once it's there, it becomes part of who you are. So the question of how to engage with each other, keeping in mind who we are, not who we would have wanted to be if we lived in an ideal world, that's a very important part of the book.
Okay.
And it culminates to making an argument for what I describe as ethical sadism, which is a very paradoxical term. We usually don't think of sadism together with ethics. Actually, more than anything, sadism is something that we think of as not ethical. But I propose that there are ways to think about sadism, recognizing that it can also be a form of care when it forces us to stay with difficult things, when a force in ourselves or another, and I think of sadism, that the ethical sadism that I write about, as a form of care. It's about bending one's will, one's tendency to do things in a way that keep one safe, to go to places that don't feel comfortable, to go to places that may feel risky. And sometimes we do this for each other. And I have some examples of that in the book, also through a film that some of your audience may know, called The Night Porter, which also tangles tarries in this territory between the tangle of trauma and erotics.
Okay. It sounds fascinating. I am excited for it to come out and to read it. I feel like it'll really kind of probably spin my head in a lot of different directions that I didn't know it could go. In terms of understanding a lot of these topics, because it is very confusing. Yeah, like there's just so much depth to it that it's hard to wrap your head around all the different concepts and, you know, different perceptions of all of these different things. So I'm really looking forward to being able to read that and, you know, and then hopefully, you know, maybe we can talk about it again in the future, kind of once I've read it and, you know, there's a little bit more understanding to some of these things and how it relates to, I guess, to my life, and then just understanding how it relates to other people as well, right?
Sure, that would be a lot of fun. And I'm also like really thankful that you were willing to kind of like travel down this rabbit hole with me, because I'm very aware that it's a rabbit hole. So
yeah,
like thanks for like signing up for that.
No, absolutely. Because I think that really what I think it does highlight is, I mean, as you explain a topic, I think we assume it means one thing, and then what it actually means is something so different. And I think that's where the confusion comes from, is that people think they have an understanding of it. And then when you kind of explain it in a different way, it's just like you're kind of like, well, what I thought I knew maybe then isn't quite what I know. And then you realize that there's a lot more that you maybe almost need to understand, right? So yeah, it's good for that. Yeah. For everybody listening, where can they find you? Like through socials? Where's the best place to kind of, I guess, find some of your work, to kind of go down that hole if they wanted to reach out, contact you and everything?
Well, people can look up my website, which is my first and last name, avgisaketopoulou.com. I'm also on Instagram at Avgolis98, AVGOLIS 98. And I have a pretty active Instagram. And I also, once the book is out, I am going to be very engaged with anybody who writes reviews or leaves comments online. So wherever you leave your comments or reviews for books you read, I'm certainly going to be looking that up and writing or kind of like engaging with it. So please feel free to reach out. I'm really interested in what people will do with some of the ideas and what they'll think about some of the ideas. So I'm really excited to see kind of like what life the book takes in people's minds.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Like I read some of your papers, some of the work that was out there, and I was so I'm excited for the book. I really am excited for the book. And it comes out, February 7th, correct?
Yes, next Tuesday.
Okay.
Comes out February 7th.
Yeah.
There's also launches. If anybody wants to tune in, there's also a couple of launches online. You can find information about that on my website.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. I highly recommend to everybody listening to get the book, to read it. Just the little bits that I kind of did, find online and stuff. It sounds fascinating, and I am really excited for it. So thank you for doing this interview. Thank you for sharing these different concepts and perspectives and all of this stuff with everybody. I'm sure everybody listening has questions, or it brought up some stuff in their minds that they're probably not even aware of that, was a thing. So I'm kind of curious to see what road this brings other people to as well.
Thank you, Sarah, for the time, and thank you for being game for all this.
Absolutely. All right, guys, thanks for listening, and stay tuned for next week.